Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Anagage podcast. It's always a pleasure to have you. Just before we get started, just a very quick plug. I published my book called In Search of the Infinite, a psychedelic memoir. If you like religion and philosophy, I highly recommend it, but I'll give more details at the end of the podcast. So today's guest is JP Marceau. Very happy to have him. He's very bright. I really like his thinking. And also, he recently published this book right here, Post-Reductionist Christianity, A Way Out of the Meaning Crisis. Highly recommend it. It's very nicely written. It lays out kind of these arguments very nicely. I also like that it's pretty like concise. Like you can read this in like I don't know, 4 hours maybe, like certainly in a day if you put your mind to it. And that's a really good thing where in a lot of books, things fluff out a lot. They get dragged down a lot. So I really like that it was just super concise. So yeah, really recommends you guys getting the book if you like these types of topics. And yeah, and then in this episode, we're just gonna unpack some of these ideas and kind of debate some little points that I think are quite interesting. So yeah, welcome, JP. It's truly a pleasure to have you here.
Thanks, Thiago. Thanks for inviting me. And yeah, I'm happy you liked the book. I did try to keep it short, especially for the kind of audience I had in mind when writing it, people who are more scientifically inclined and who don't necessarily have a huge background in philosophy. I think like this is the kind of format I would have liked at the time, being in that position, let's say 10, 15 years ago, where it's just like logical argumentation, kind of like if you're reading a science textbook, let's say, or a math textbook, and no fluff, as you said, and just the most important stuff. Because I don't think for the core of what you need for getting out of the meaning crisis, you need that much, to be honest. I think it's more of a matter of communicating it. I think people like us, our job is more to communicate things and not so much to discover all kinds of new things.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, I think that was a great choice. I also should have mentioned that I think I forgot that JP was on the podcast before. He was actually one of the very first. So I think that was like 4 or 5 years ago, and he was like the third person on the podcast. And he's also the first person that I've had, repeated because I try not to do that just because there's so many interesting people to talk with. So I try to have variety. But just because I like his thinking so much and because he had his new book out, I figured I would invite him again. And I think it's like something that I really like about UJP is like I think we're very similar in the way that we recognize kind of Pageau and Vervaeke to be like two really solid foundations, like the 2 feet that you kind of walk on, which is not only has just two interesting people around a larger group of other interesting people, but actually representing like the two best possible worldviews, like distilled to the best possible presentation. At least that's how I see it. And like ever since discovering Pageau and Vervaeke, which I think was more or less maybe at the same time as you, like more or less my entire intellectual life, let's say, was to try to synthesize them together in some way. And I think that's what you've done as well. Although I think you do it more metaphysically, but I think the project is very similar. So to me, I just completely love that, and I just see myself a lot.
Yeah. I think I don't know when you first heard about them, but I think for my part, I heard about both of them through Jordan Peterson, like towards the beginning of his like public fame. So like in 2017, I think Jonathan first appeared on Jordan's channel, and also Jordan tweeted like a few things to promote a course that John was recording at the time. He was recording his Buddhism and cognitive science or something.
Cognitive science of Buddhism. I also that was also my intro through Reiki.
Yeah, so you got in early because this was like before Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. The quality was pretty bad. Not a lot of viewers, but I watched that and then I think I might have also like read some things that he recommended in that course. So like I knew that from at least the scientific perspective, John was doing like the best I had seen in terms of addressing the meaning crisis. Otherwise, like most people were just like honestly not dealing with the question within a scientific frame. I saw some people addressing things from a philosophical perspective, But I was very attracted by what Jonathan was doing, what Jordan was doing also to some extent, but because Jordan rather wasn't talking about metaphysics explicitly, like I always felt like it was missing, like is it just psychology? But Jonathan didn't fear to go there, so I was attracted by what he was saying, but it took me a long time to understand what Jonathan was saying, and like when I understood what he was saying, I was still like in search of, let's see, a rigorous series of steps to get there. And bridging between John and Jonathan was the the work there. And I think I got lucky that I got in early enough knowing both of them that I became friends with both of them and we could keep this relationship going. So I could always like validate ideas with them. So it took a few years to I think make the bridges as well as I could make them. And that's what I tried to synthesize in the book. It took, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 years of dialogues with the both of them. But I think we got to something pretty solid. For the last 2, 3 years, I would say, like not much has changed. I struggle to see how we could make, I don't know, better bridges at some point. Maybe things will need to change, but I think things have been pretty stable for the past few years. And anyway, I tried to synthesize that in the book.
Right. Yeah. Awesome. And I think you did a great job. And also I'm just incredibly jealous that you just had access to just both of them to, just go back and forth with ideas and whatnot. It's a very, very privileged position. Um, so yeah, maybe let's just get into it. And so maybe just to provide context for people that haven't read your book, maybe just let's start with like just an overall overview of the argument, like of the first part and the second part, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, yeah, sounds good. I mean, even before we do that, I'd be curious to know, like you said that for me the bridge is more metaphysical. So I use philosophy. For you, what did you use? It might help me as context.
I would say I generally try to come more from a phenomenological perspective, and then to me that's validated a lot if I also see it reflected in the cognitive science and then within the stories as well. So like I always try to have a triangle of these three things, like my experience, what the stories are telling me, and then like the science of like how cognition works. So I also try to take into account metaphysics, but to me, a lot of times, and I think this is just because I'm not very gifted for like very high abstraction. So like a lot of times, for example, when I hear some of your arguments, especially when they get like very, very technical with Vervaeke, like I kind of get it, but I get it in the same way that you might get like in a way that an undergrad might like know a mathematical formula like by memory, like they can say it to you, but like they don't. I feel like I don't truly understand it at a deep level. So I don't reject it, but yeah, I try to not make that has a pillar for me.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, I might use that for the way I explain things. We'll see. But yeah, as you said, the book is divided into two parts. I can also mention the introduction. The introduction is kind of a mythological review of the situation and what I'm gonna go through. I talk about the zombie myth as a way to get people thinking about the meaning crisis and how it's related to materialism. But the basic like history of things is that we became nihilists and materialists because of the early days of science, which tended to be reductionistic. I I go over that we like it was initially just a hypothesis that Galileo made. He wanted to explain the fact that when we deal with the world, we see qualities, but when Galileo was doing math, he was able to explain things in a way that had no qualities in them. So you can explain how things move using math. I mean, obviously it was pretty primitive at this time, but you could see like the implications of this. Like if we can mathematize the external world, there's no qualities in math. So what's the break? Like how do you separate that? And the way that Yellow tried to get out of it was to say that qualities exist in minds. We sort of somehow put qualities onto the external world, but in itself, the external world is just math, just like abstract math. And physicists and engineers were able to make progress for a while with that, but this stopped at some point. Um, it broke down at a few places, and I explained in the first part of the book that okay, we became like materialists and reductionists through that hypothesis, but there's no good reason to keep doing that. In in many branches of the sciences, this has broken down. We talked already about cognitive science, so you're probably pretty well aware of this. But in cognitive science, okay, last time I spoke with John about this, he told me that I don't know, maybe around half of the people like are just not reductionists at all. There's still people who try to think of things more computationally. Like people coming from computer science might still sometimes try to reduce cognition down to, I don't know, simple programs you can code somewhere. But I think even that is breaking down. And many people coming from cognitive science, from neuroscience or biology and these things are they're much more likely to be non-reductionists. So that's one point, but I go over a few places in science where that has been breaking down. So that leaves us that in the first part of the book, we can regain the classical tradition, which wasn't reductionistic. And then in the second part of the book, I explained that with Christianity, you can go even further. There are a few things like practical things, like the fact that if you want to practice your way out of the meaning crisis, if you want to relearn to perceive the world not as a materialist, you're gonna need to practice that somewhere. And there are no like Platonic or Aristotelian schools that you can go to and actually like practice to see the world that way, but there are churches where you can go and that will help you learn to see things non-materialistically. And besides those kinds of more practical arguments, there's also theoretical arguments where I tend to take Christianity actually as a scientific hypothesis, where if you grant the model, what does the model explain? So that's something in general that happens in science. If someone proposes a new model that's weird, but that works, we'll end up adopting it and considering its entities to exist. So when Newton introduced the idea of gravity, for instance, people thought he was insane because everyone back then had a mechanistic picture of the world where things like push and pull against each other. And really, in the external world, that's all there is. Maybe with the mind, something was different, but in at least the material world, it was just pushing and pulling. But with gravity and action at a distance, Newton was introducing something different. People thought he was insane, but because he was able to predict things more he was able to predict things that people couldn't predict otherwise, and also he wasn't making any more mistakes than people were previously. People ended up granting his model. So I think the same thing goes with the incarnation in Christianity. If you grant the incarnation, of course it's one of those shocking things at first. You need some faith in the model, but when you take it seriously and you try to see the implications, you can explain so many things and you don't make more mistakes than you would otherwise, that I think it just makes sense to adopt it. So that's the basic structure of the book. There's a lot more we can dive into those different places, but I'll let you guide the discussion.
Yeah, awesome. That was a great breakdown. And by the way, I think you didn't, if I remember correctly, and I think you should have, of like introducing your personal like story with like the zombie dreams and things like that. Like I think that was great, and I love it when books are like have this personal dimension to it, which is what I try to do with mine, for example. So from your perspective, you're like trying to see, if I went back in time, like how would I convince myself of like how do I bridge these two worldviews? That's also kind of what I try to make, but way less theological and philosophical. Like I kind of frame it as a memoir, and I think to some degree, if it's well done, which mine probably isn't, but in your case, I think when it has this personal dimension, I think it helps a lot. And I was just awestruck when I heard your stories about the zombie, and then like not only the fact that it was that you had them, so it reflected what you were grappling at metaphysically, but also the fact that you solved it, and the fact that you solved it through the same story that you then was your metaphysical solution. I just thought like, holy crap, that's just amazing.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I'm not totally sure, but I tend not to like to talk about myself too much. I think it's also I don't know. I wonder like how I would have looked at it 10, 15 years ago when I was like a materialist and had to deal with the meaning crisis. I it might be some aspect of my personality. I'm not totally sure, but I suspect that I would not have wanted to read like a personal book. I suspect I would have wanted to have just the arguments. But when people ask me to tell like the story about myself, I'm happy to do it. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know if I would have at least for the kind of audience I'm going for. I don't think it. might have been that good an idea to lead straight with like my like personal stuff.
Right, right. Yeah, 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 I understand that. Yeah. Also, like, I don't think this is necessarily like a fault or something, but something else that I noticed about the book is that it does feel like there's a bit of a jump between the first part and the second part, whereas like the first part seems very like logical, like axiom by axiom, kind of like a Euclidean project to some degree. While the second one, it's more like, you know, here's a vision, and then like if you adopt that vision, then you can kind of think this way. But then the problem is that the vision for the people that you're trying to address, more or less, which is like the materialist, let's say, or at the very least, maybe someone that's already like a non-reductive materialist, but maybe they're a bit, like uncertain about any metaphysics or anything like that. Um, I think what you're asking is like a big ask, and so and to some degree, like I see myself as like maybe between a Brit, like maybe an in-between point between like the non-reductive non-Christian, let's say, and then like you, which is like a full-blown Christian metaphysics. And I feel like that there was quite a a large jump to some degree. I'm just curious to see if you received any kind of feedback of like maybe people in my position or like complete materialists of like saying, I love the first part, but like the second part made no sense to me.
Yeah, good question. I don't know yet. The most of the feedback I have gotten on the book came from people who were already like somewhere I think closer to the Christian pole in this. So and also I think I would really like to have feedback from people who like know nothing of Jonathan Pageau and all these people and like reads the book and see what they think at the end. I would be really curious, but like so far, especially because I mean it's from Jonathan's press, so most of the publicity comes from there. So most of the users like are most of the readers will be familiar with Jonathan in this kind of argumentation. And I think what happens is like the book plays a part in like a larger discussion, a larger kind of research project that people are doing. So the kind of feedback I've gotten is mainly people who like it's positive feedback from people who didn't totally understand like why Jonathan could say some of the things that he was saying. People who like were attracted by what he was saying, but couldn't like make the jump to like some of the more like deeply metaphysical claims that Jonathan is doing. So that's that's most of the feedback I got, and I had feedback from a few people who found it like useful for them. Like like a few things clicked for them, let's say, that allowed them to go further on that route. But I haven't yet gotten, and I would like to have feedback from people who like aren't necessarily part of that like wider research project and who just like read the book, what they think of the first part, the second part. Because even the first part, like if you're not familiar with I wonder where people would like stop following the argument pretty much. I think like the criticisms of materialism, I think lots of people can probably get behind. Like some of them like people might not agree with all of them, but like at least some of them must land, I think, with most people. But then going to classical metaphysics, where you consider that there are different layers to reality, even if that's something that many scientists are doing now in cognitive science and neuroscience and biology and so on. Even if many scientists are doing this, I would I would wonder how many materialistically inclined people like have a hard time like understanding what we mean by forms. I try to do my best to talk about those layers well, but I would be surprised if like someone who's a total materialist just reads the book and like right off the bat understands what that means. Like I would expect that it's like a book that people would like have to read a few times at different points and they could like get a bit further every time. And also like I try to recommend lots of footnotes for people who want to read more, but I would I would expect it's one of those where you need to like read it several times, and each time you'll be able to get a bit further and understand a bit more why you can go a bit further.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, I do think that like even on the first part, I think for a complete materialist, like some things are a bit hard to understand, like especially things like forms and things like that, precisely like because to some degree, like you're inviting someone to invent a new ontology that they obviously they don't have, but also they never even heard of. Like most people that don't have a philosophy background, like they don't think about these things at all. So it's like, so when you introduce these things, the only way that people have of like making any sort of analogy with their worldview is like, okay, then there's this world, like the spirit world to some degree that just has these weird immaterial things. That's like people think about spirits and like all kinds of weird things. But yeah, it's quite tricky. But I think you did a great job, and you're right. I think it's the type of book that, especially if you're coming from a place that's very divorced from the worldview that you're presenting, so everything is new, that you need to digest it slowly and kind of like read, several people on it, reread the works and so on.
But yeah, so in your case, you like the first part was like you agreed everything was fine, and then the second part on like Christianity, it felt like what did it feel like? Was it like intelligible, but like not like forceful enough for you to make the jump?
Yeah, I would say so. Like I'll try to give some more examples a bit later on the conversation, but yeah, like I kind of understand what you're saying most of the time, but it's like, yeah, that just doesn't feel strong enough to like make such a big of a jump. Um, but also like, but also I do that with like, again, I'll unpack this a bit more later, but like I try to do that like very receptive because it's a worldview that to some degree I want to embrace. Um, but yeah, but there's some things that just bother me. And then maybe it'll get slightly better after this conversation there. That's part of my selfish goal.
Maybe even before we get there, one thing I'd be curious because like I did take the approach of not like trying to force something on people, but rather trying to present a vision that's attractive. But there's another approach that many, I think most Christian apologists probably are taking, which is rather to give forceful arguments. Um, so let's say people might give like proofs for like there's like two kinds of arguments. One is just philosophical arguments, like people try to make proofs for, let's say, the existence of God or something. But that's I don't think that's necessary anymore because the first part of the book I think gets all of that anyway. Like if you are a classical metaphysician, if you agree with John Vervaeke's metaphysics, like you believe in God. You might not call it exactly that, but there's a ground of being, ground of mythology, all these things. So it's um, like that I think kind of apologetics is not necessary. Another kind of apologetics though is more historical, like people who try to make historical proofs for why Jesus really resurrected from the tomb based on what we see like in the apostles dying or in like the written records that we have that are so overwhelmingly more reliable than anything we have. Like so there's this kind of argumentation too. I don't make it because I like what I personally I don't like it that much because I fear that it reduces Christianity to the method you have of presenting it. So and also many people are doing it and I feel like I don't have to do it. So I did the other approach. But I'd be curious to know like if like in your case, do you feel like the more forceful approach of historical argumentation is more persuasive?
No, not at all. Because when I first started to engage with all of these things, it was like when I was a teenager. So like I don't know, 15 years ago or something like that. And I did read and watch like a lot of apologetics and whatnot. And that made me less of a Christian. Like that made me more atheist at the time because I was like, what you're saying, first of all, I think a lot of the arguments just aren't that good, to be quite honest. I think a lot of them do have some holes. Not in the sense that they're illogical, that they're just like not foolproof as I think people try to make it out to be. Um, and also I always got this weird vibe from like Christian apologists, which is like we have this conclusion. Now let's just try to come up with anything we can just so that we justify that. And I always saw that as like the antithetical project of like truth seeking. And so I always had this like very knee-jerk reaction to it. And to me, what helped me the most, which is why again, like I was talking about, that my approach is a bit more phenomenological plus the story, which is like to me, what helped me was For example, when Jonathan Pageau talks a lot about the patterns in stories, and I'm like, oh yeah, I can see it in that story, and then I can see it in myself as well, in my own life, right? And that's kind of what allowed me to get deeper and deeper into Christianity, which is like making smaller and smaller leaps of faith of like, okay, this story has shown me so much about reality that I'm willing to make a leap, like a Kierkegaardian leap of faith to the next thing, as long as it's not too big, because then it's just incomprehensible to me. So that's my experience. But obviously, people are different. I do know that for some people, they like this type of apologetic debate.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I know many people for whom that worked. For me, it didn't work that much. I think I don't know if if it's the same kind of holes that you find, but personally, I think coming from a arts scientific background, anything like historical or soft sciences stuff was just not very like convincing to me. Now, like being already Christian, I can appreciate them more. I think like it makes me appreciate. I have more respect for, I think, the social sciences in general. I'm less dismissive than I used to be because of my conversion to Christianity. But it's still, I find it more convincing and also more useful in my life to see, as you said, how the structures of the incarnation are true in my own life, in different stories. So I think I ended up doing something that's more closer to you anyway.
Right, right. Yeah, makes sense. Also, when I was talking about that, a lot of times when these metaphysical debates get, quite um, when they get a bit technical and specific, that sometimes I struggle a lot to follow. I would say, specific in the context of like your book and like kind of like your work plus Vervaeke, probably the area that I think I struggle the most is kind of this notion of emanation. Like emergence for me, like seems very obvious, and emanation to me less so. Like I understand that, like to me, it's super clear when I think about like the laws of nature. So like the very, very top, like structuring everything down below. But then everything else, to me, I kind of like, yeah, I can see what you're saying, but like not really. So it's like maybe just try to give a basic example, just maybe for people that are new, and maybe just try to be like, you know, I don't know, technical, I suppose, to see if maybe that clicks better, and maybe this will help some of the other discussions.
Yeah. I think a simple example maybe is what happens in our own minds when we make a decision that's like emanation is going to happen. Your your mind is a certain pattern that will structure some lower level patterns. And let's say one I think good place to see it is let's say that you have a car accident or some kind of accident, and you will see different options will present themselves to you, will emerge from different subpersonalities in you. So part of you maybe wants to run away, part of you wants to freeze, part of you wants to go have a fight with someone who's involved in this. Like there's different options that present themselves to you, and they're disorganized. But you can make the decision to like pick one of those, to select, to constrain away some of them and to pick one of them. And that is an example of emanation. Your higher level form, your mind will constrain lower personalities in you and like make one grow to you do so that you pick one thing and you don't do other things. So that's an example of emanation that's close to us. Does that help?
Yes. Yes, it does have some issues with that example, but I'll save that a bit towards later on. But so that's an example that I think is quite easy for people to follow, at least the general gist. And then how would you define it like a bit more technically and philosophically?
Yeah, so technically there are many forms involved. That's also why these discussions can get like sometimes confusing because like there are forms involved at both of those layers. There's like at the highest layer, your mind, when you make the decision to pick one thing and not other things, there's a form, that's a form there, the form of your mind. But like your sub-personalities too, they also have forms. They're not totally formless. They're like potential actions you could take. They're potential relative to your overall mind, but They still have forms. They're not completely nothing. Um, but technically, what we say is that the higher level is going to have some form, some structure that's going to constrain potential that's lower. Um, and then you can talk about things both top down and bottom up. So as we just discussed, it was in terms of emanation. So there is a form, there's a constraint coming from above that's going to constrain, that's going to pick, that's going to select what's below. And you can also say conversely that from the multitude of options that emerge, one of them is gonna emerge to be the the form, to be the overall structure. So the option that you take, let's say that you decide to go and help the other people involved in the accident, then that emerges as the overall structure, the overall form of what you do in that case. So forms emanate down to matter, to potential, and conversely, potential emerges up into forms.
But yeah, I think that's a great breakdown. So maybe let's have that as like maybe some context, especially for people who are listening in, and then I think maybe there's going to be some more further development later on when I kind of give you some specific examples. Um, but so something else that I'd like to get your thoughts about as well, which I think I was a little bit confused about one of these points in your book, which is you kind of seem to have given up on panpsychism. And one of the things that I saw you argue is that you looked at kind of like when you go to the very bottom of reality, because you only see potential, then I think your claim was something like, okay, this is too ontologically poor to like qualify for consciousness of any kind. Um, but then to me, like I'm just not exactly sure like why that would be the case. That's number one. It's like because I think at least the way that I see panpsychism is precisely that consciousness isn't this thing like in the universe. So as if like that you look deeper and deeper and then eventually find it. It's just like baked in into the very fabric. And so like to me, this like field of potential doesn't bother me too much. And then also uh with panpsychism, you know, if you assume that this bottom does have consciousness, because there's no place that doesn't have consciousness to some degree, then it also, like, if you go all the way up, you also have the same thing. So it's like all the way up, there's also consciousness, and that's kind of like standard theism. So it's like, what is the what is the issue with this worldview, and like, what do you think is your best uh, like justification for denying consciousness just because it's potential rather than something concrete?
Yeah, so I think what's really important here is to be clear about what we mean by consciousness. Um, the way that I talk about it in the book is phenomenal consciousness. So the what it's like to like stub your toe, to drink something, to see some color, like the what it's like to experience something. That if you talk about consciousness with that in mind, there are other definitions of consciousness, but if you start with that, I do think that when you get like far away from human experience and even like certain kinds of human experiences, because there's many aspects of ourselves that aren't conscious. If you get far from humans, you can see something that's continuous and maybe analogous with consciousness. But if you keep using the word consciousness, I think you run into problems. Like you're gonna dilute the word that you're using. So if like typically when we are conscious, that's related to like us having some well, I mean, people have different theories for what is like correlated with consciousness and what isn't. But I think you would struggle to find a definition where the experience we have of something maps onto just bare potential at the very lowest layer of our ontology, something that has no form at all. I would struggle to see how you could like talk about consciousness there in a way that relates to our experiences of what it's like to be something, to do something. Um, and I think similarly for if you look at abstract forms, if you look at mathematical patterns, for instance, that I think exist. I think if you take science seriously, you have to consider those to be real. Otherwise, you're destroying the tools that you're using to see the world. So you're destroying your entire worldview. So I think you have to take forms seriously to see that they exist. But something that never changes, like the Pythagorean theorem, for instance, I would struggle to see how you could use the word consciousness there without like diluting the word away from how we use it normally about ourselves.
Yeah, but about kind of like the issue of forms, like the way that I've typically saw it is that even if you take the panpsychist stance, like in the same way that you can say that a table isn't conscious, like in the higher level sense, because it doesn't have the right configuration in order to have this, this combination that somehow happens, right? So in the same way that you can do that, like why are mathematical, formulas and laws, why are they the same kind? So because if that's the case, then they don't have conscious in the higher sense, and that doesn't matter. It's just not the kind of thing that can aggregate consciousness into the consciousness that is close to the human experience. But it's also not created in the human being out of nowhere.
But I think like panpsychists, they have to say that everything is conscious at some level. So, like the table, for instance, doesn't have to be conscious at the level of the table, but it has to be conscious at some level. So, let's say it's fundamental particles. That's what like panpsychists would typically say. There are different kinds of panpsychism. Sometimes, like most people, I think in panpsychism want to put consciousness down at the very lowest layer because then they sort of can build up more complex things from smaller consciousnesses. There's also macro panpsychism where you could consider the universe as a whole to be conscious, and then some like parts of it may or may not be conscious. So it's possible that the universe as a whole is conscious, but maybe like the particles aren't conscious. It's like so you can have both of these views, and I would struggle to see another option, but you have to say that if you're a panpsychist, everything is conscious at some level. So like I don't think that putting everything down to the lowest layer is gonna work because potential, like if you just look at potential, I don't think that qualifies as conscious. If you look just at the highest layer of forms, I don't see how that would be consciousness. So if like I could see some workarounds maybe, and we can try to dive into them. But I think if you end up having to acknowledge that potential exists on its own, that in itself it's unconscious, if you have to acknowledge that forms exist on their own and like they're not conscious on their own, then you're already so close to like you're already so close to classical metaphysics that I don't see why you would bother that much with panpsychism anymore. Um, but I mean, I could still walk around and we could like talk about them more if you want. But before I say more, I'd like to get your input on what I just said.
No, yeah, that makes sense. Like, yeah, I'm not exactly sure like how this plays out, but I appreciate your explanation. That there's definitely an argument there, and also something else that I wanted to cover when you mentioned kind of like this top bottom panpsychism, something that I would like to get your take on it, which ended up being not the same thing, but somewhat similar. It's kind of like a lot of versions of idealism, and that's actually something that, like, to me, appeals to me a little bit because again, it makes this primacy of consciousness, and again, it doesn't treat this consciousness as a thing; it's just like baked in. And to some degree, obviously, it's kind of crazy when you think about it. But to some degree, the way that I've tried to think, especially when I read another book from Kastrup a few months back, um, is that like when you think like in such high abstract terms that just I mean, there's problems with this. Like, I don't want to be dismissive, but like to some degree, there's kind of this aspect that you're just playing with language. It's like, okay, there's matter. Okay, but what is matter really? Like, really, really, really. So it's like if you have this, if you take this stance of like this, some kind of the one, let's say, and that is the cause of reality. And then you can say, well, okay, but there's matter. Okay, but if that caused it and you assume that has mind to some degree, then it's not so crazy anymore. And then again, then this has these parallels with panpsychism, even though they're not the same thing. So I'm just curious, like how do you see this aspect of idealism, and what do you think falls short?
Yeah, I mean, what you just said, I think makes me want to stress the idea of analogy. So I have no issue saying that God as a mind, the one that's behind everything as a mind, like it's obviously analogical to what we mean by mind, because God is outside of space and time and so on. So there's like it's analogous to talk of God as having a mind. And I think it's fine to say that everything that is created is going to be analogous to God also. So like there has to be something analogous to God in matter, let's say. And I could see that, for instance, in the Trinity. In the Trinity, there's like Jesus who will emerge towards the Father, who is the image of the Father, but who is like also lower than the Father because he's lower and not lower than the Father. So like there's something analogous to matter in the Trinity. There's something analogous to forms too. So you can always do these analogies between creation and God. At least in Christianity, this works quite well. But if you use the same words without saying that you're using it as an analogy, I think you're gonna trip yourself up. And also, like some words, I think are better suited than others. I think the word consciousness in particular, I think is like means too many things in the culture. I think we have to be careful when we use it. But I do think that like if you at least want to grasp with that term many of the things that people typically mean with it, it becomes really hard to say that like matter is conscious, that forms are conscious. So in the case of idealism specifically, um, I mean, there's aspects of this that like you can see to some extent in Christianity. In idealism in general, I think you get the top-down emanation quite well. There is a mind like at the top of the hierarchy, and from that mind there emanates simpler things, all the way down to material creation. But I think the issue with that kind of worldview is like in idealist systems in general. But and by the way, many of the ancient metaphysical systems were idealistic in that way. You can see that in Plato. You can see that in most Eastern philosophies too. The issue is that well, there are many issues, but you don't give enough place to matter, pretty much. If you don't have this idea that God didn't just create the heavens, but he also created the earth. And then it's through marriages of heaven and earth that things are created. If you don't have this, then everything is just a cascade down from from the top, from ideas. And the lower you get, then it's going to be harder and harder to say that things are actually good. So sometimes it's explicit, like some of the Platonists said that matter was evil, but often it's not as explicit. It's just that you won't see people giving the same status, let's say, to poor people or women in like many cultures, but you do see that in Christianity.
But why not though? Because I can understand how that plays out historically, but I'm not sure if I understand the metaphysical implication, because the way that I see Christianity flipping that is, and again, I might be wrong just because I'm not metaphysically inclined, but the way that I see it is has a stance. It's like this is the right way to view the world, and this is how we should align ourselves. And then you can also connect it to the story, but like I don't see that claim being made like metaphysically. Like obviously this is super hard to talk about things in this way, but let's say in an alternative world where the metaphysics of Christianity and the metaphysics of the world would be different, that then that inverse hierarchy wouldn't exist anymore. I think it would, because I think it's ultimately not exactly the right word, but like ethical to some degree.
Yeah, I think yeah, some of the I think it's pretty explicit in some systems, like the caste systems in Hinduism, let's say. I think it's tied with this kind of emanationist metaphysics that the lower you get from forms, the like lower value you have. And I think in the Neoplatonists also it was explicit, like that matter, that our bodies, they don't matter, they're not important, that kind of thing. So I think it became explicit like at least sometimes that I can think of.
But do you think is explicit the other way around on Christianity based on metaphysics alone?
I mean, I don't know that I would say metaphysics alone. Like, I think actually it's interesting. I think it's even part of what we're saying. The fact that in Christianity, metaphysics is not alone, but metaphysics is the I thing that's supposed to give itself to the lower things, and the lower things will also reflect and emerge into the higher things of metaphysics, for instance. I think in Christianity, all of this fits together. So the fact that God can go and sacrifice himself for the word, for the world, is the same idea that matter is good, that the world is good. The fact that Jesus took care of the poor, let's say, and associated himself with sinners, even, all of that is also to say that, like, what's at the lowest layer is also good and has a chance to emerge into something that's higher. And then I also think that's why, like, you can see science emerging in the Christian West because people saw that matter was good, it was worth studying, it could yield higher and higher things if we gave it body, if we gave it time and attention. So I think it's like I wouldn't say metaphysics alone because they're never disconnected, but like metaphysics live with Christian practices that reinforce the metaphysics and vice versa.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
But I think there's all kinds of like you can find many things in Christianity that have to do with this, like like the idea that matter emerges towards forms and that forms give themselves down to matter. You can map it to the you can map it within the Trinity, how the Father gives himself to the Son, how the Son like rises to the Father, gives himself and the world to the Father. You can see it in how the Incarnation happens also, where it's a sacrifice of God for the world, but it's also how the world becomes united with God in emergence. You can see it in how Adam is created, like taking dust from the ground and like breathing down air um, down into that dust. So like these emergence and emanation dynamics are all over in Christianity, and they're directly connected to why we give value to matter, to the poor, to even just creation, like why creation happened, why it's worth saving from death and sin, all of these things.
And also like tying it back to consciousness, like something that some like I can kind of understand your vision. And I think classical metaphysics kind of saved this to some degree, I think. So maybe it's just kind of my own thinking, especially my older thinking, kind of like pulling me back. But from time to time, like I think back about how you deal with consciousness, and I feel like I still get a bit confused and that I didn't go anywhere because you try to like undermine reductive materialism by these notions of emergence and emergence and whatnot. But then again, you have this move where it's like the bottom isn't conscious. And therefore, until consciousness happens, there's a jump, there's an emergence. Uh, and obviously, that's a problem for the reductive materialist, but also not that many people, I think, nowadays are reductive materialists. So, like that position, that jump to consciousness, that is already their position, right? And so, and to some degree, like that is precisely the hard problem of consciousness. And that's so even though I don't identify myself as an idealist or a panpsychist or anything, the reason why I'm always drawn to some degree to that worldview and I try to keep it at least in mind is because it seems to solve that in a way that nothing else does. Because I do think that no matter because the issue is like no matter the emergence that you can claim and that exists as several layers of reality, which it does, I think the standard claim, which I think is a decent claim, is that that kind of emergence, which a lot of philosophers call strong emergence, cannot be reduced to the emergence that you typically see in the world. And that's the examples that you usually give. So what do you think I'm missing that where your worldview kind of does away with the problem of consciousness?
I think one thing that's worth saying is that even like in us, we have to be careful when we say that we're conscious. There I think that the central part of our consciousness, I think you might want to call attention. You can even say love in a Christian context, because like we don't just become conscious. Like where does human consciousness come from? And it's shaped largely by other consciousnesses. Like if you don't have your parents to interact with you and form your mind, if you don't love your parents, if you're not interested in mimicking them, looking at them, and if they don't have that reciprocal love for you, then like you you won't be conscious nearly in the same way. You probably will develop some kind of consciousness. Actually, you might just die. Like if you don't have human attention when you're an infant, you'll just like die. But like if you, what's important to say is that your love for your parent loves for you, is what is gonna let your consciousness grow. Like your consciousness grows, your feelings, your impressions, your sense of self, your emotions as coherent patterns, like all of these things are gonna emerge from your love towards your parent, or you can also say that they're going to emanate down from your parent. So, like, I wouldn't have an issue saying that like this kind of primordial attention, this love that happens between parent and child. I think I see this all of over creation. I could see it in matter everywhere, but like the emergence that happens, the strong emergence, if you want to say that happens towards consciousness in infants, let's say, that like I don't think that mapping it to I don't think it's that helpful to try to map it to, let's say, micro consciousnesses and neurons that assemble in some way. Um, I think so. So there's that's like one aspect. One is when you talk about consciousness, it's worth stressing first attention and love. The other aspect of it is like how I see it, why the art form of consciousness doesn't bother me anymore. I think it's because when you take seriously the classical hierarchy that you have in classical metaphysics, different layers of forms and potentiality, like the the art problem of consciousness becomes like just one of the many like similar things that happen all over creation. Like there are so many places where form and potential meet, and even within us, like I become, as I said earlier, like I when we consider the role of attention and love, I become much more interested in that than in like consciousness at large. I become more focused on attention and love, and that I can see all over creation. Um, so like I think what happened is like I used to be very interested by the art problem of consciousness when I was a panpsychist, because it gave me a way away from it basically gave me a path away from materialism. It was like a much better worldview, but it like when you adopt something like classical metaphysics or Christian metaphysics, it's unnecessary to go all the way to something like panpsychism. Like what I want to say for sure is there has to be an analogy between all the different layers. Like my neurons, for instance, it's of course they participate in some way in my consciousness because the lower layer participate in the higher layers. That of course it happens, but I don't have to be committed to using the term consciousness for all of those things. It might be like I don't have like absolutely strong arguments against like panpsychisms in all ways. Like maybe there's a way to reformulate it, but I I don't think I have to commit myself to it, let's say. I don't It doesn't have the same attractiveness that it used to have because I have, let's say, safer options now to deal with materialism and nihilism.
That makes sense. And when I come to it, I don't come necessarily from a place of like trying to escape nihilism because I feel like my worldview uh can accommodate consciousness to some degree. Not accommodate, not in the sense of like that it's solved, obviously, but in a way that doesn't bother me. But I do like to keep the problem at bay because I feel like you have to grapple with it in a decent way. And if you don't, that kind of makes me question the worldview that's informing it. And so that's kind of why I still like to explore it. And what you mentioned, like this is also something that I don't remember if it was on the actual book or in one of your talks or podcasts with someone, or maybe it was both. But this example that you were giving about the mother loving the infant, that also like lost me a little bit. I mean, I understand it, but I don't agree on how it's framed, and so maybe I'm missing something because like when you say that I understand this dynamic of like sacrifice and the wanting from each side, and you can call that creates love, and that creates a person, and that creates a person capable of love and capable of lovable attention. I think that's very strong and very helpful. But to me, that's completely different from consciousness. In fact, it presumes consciousness because the very idea of wanting and sacrifice, all these terms are meaningless without a pre-existing structure of attention and intentionality and so on and so forth.
What kind of consciousness do you talk about there? Like, let's say in the infant, like who's like super chaotic, like 1 day old, like what kind of, what do you mean by consciousness there?
Yeah, so the way that I see, and we should have done this since the beginning because it's important to define terms, but like the way that I see it is when I call consciousness, I call the bare minimum, the lowest that you can possibly go while still having any kinds whatsoever of phenomenological experience. And to some degree, I think calling it attention is pretty good, right? And so and so like when you talk about this formation of the person and formation of love, like that is super important, but that is not the same thing. And so like trying to invoke that kind of dynamic to the hard problem of consciousness to me is like we're talking about two completely separate things.
So, I mean, if I don't have like a strong, if you want to use like consciousness specifically to talk about attention, I don't have a problem in saying that everything is attention in some way. I think it's going to be, I think yeah, I don't have a problem at all with that. In fact, I would even be okay with saying that potential as attention towards forms or as love towards forms. I would be fine saying that. It's just that using the word consciousness itself, I think it brings up like too many concepts that like most people would hear as like implying too much for that. And even for the infant, like the infant who's like 1 day old and super chaotic and doesn't even have stable like emotions, like call like saying consciousness there, I think also brings up like a lot of baggage that isn't that helpful. I think it's really useful to be able to say that the child already has love and attention towards their mother, let's say, and that around that consciousness will grow with emotions, sense of self, and all of these things. And if you just use the word consciousness, I think you lose a lot of nuance and important processes. But like I'm fine with talking about attention and love there and scaling it like down and up the hierarchy.
Okay. So then let's do it like this. Let's call it love, this like reciprocal engagement, which then creates a person and a person capable of love. And then that's called the lower level sentience, let's say. Is your claim that there's an actual, so there's two options then. Are you happy to concede that that kind of sentience exists at the base level of any kind, either emanating from the very top or emerging from the very bottom, or just being completely like interdependent with reality as such? Or do you think there's an actual jump at some point in order to make that happen? So at this level, there was no sentience, and then there's this love and attention that you talk about, a person that's even higher up.
I think that the word sentience is strong. I don't know that like I'm okay to use that word like within this context if we like scope it down this way. Um, I don't know that I would like either of those extremes totally though, to be honest. Like I would talk about continuity more than I would talk about exactly like equivocally talking about sentience at all of those layers. Um, or saying that there's a hard jump. I would tend to think that at every layer there's probably something more that happened.
But how is that possible? That's what bothers me about consciousness is like I think to some degree it has to be binary. Like if you if you conceptualize like low enough, which I think is what matters for this kind of discussion, like you just maybe help me understand of like how you think there could be an intermediate level, especially because since we're thinking about the layers of reality has as like continuous, then what happens? It's a similar problem with physics, and the Greeks also talked about this a lot, which is like if you think that there can always be an intermediate level, then you have that intermediate level forever, right? So like at some point, that jump has to happen, or no?
Yeah, I mean, fair enough. I think it's probably just the words that are tripping me up. Like, I wouldn't have an issue saying that there's love at all those layers. I do think it becomes greater in a way. Like, I would have to think about how, like, exactly this happens, but I wouldn't have an issue saying that everything within creation, let's say, like, is created, participate in God's love, is also driven in love towards like higher and lower things and so on. So if you want to call that sentience, like I don't have a strong issue against that. I think, and then the issue I would only have is, um, like if you want to use equivocally like the same word, let's say sentience for everything that exists within creation, is how do you make sense of like sentience? Uh, Like, do you try to explain why some things are like more sentient than others? I'm trying to use your term again. I don't know like if it still makes sense for that, but like how is it that it can like combine into greater versions of the same things, let's say? Like how can sentience become like more sentience in some beings? Or would you just like keep the word for the bare minimum and not have it scale at all?
For me personally, the way that I see it is that consciousness, sentience is the bare minimum, but I like to use consciousness. I use sentience because we were kind of, getting some confusion, so I wanted to distinguish. But then there's two problems after that. One is the complexification problem, which is like how do you get a more complex form of experience, let's say. And the way that I see that is through biology. So it's like there's this basic experience, and then the more complex your nervous system is, then like it's kind of a Lego. It's like you attach more things, you get complexity, you get further and further down the realm of complexity. Then there's the other issue, which is like the combination problem of like how do actual entities form compared to any other entity and whatnot. And to that, I have no idea because I believe if someone knew, they would solve the hard problem of consciousness with the argument for panpsychism. So I don't really understand how that's possible, but I still feel like that problem, even though it's big and unsolvable, it's still, to me, it still feels like a smaller problem than the jump in the lowest level possible of sentience.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, do you try because the way that I think I make sense. I'm trying to map things because I'm I just use the word love for like three things. I use love for just not just the process where the lower can go into the higher and the higher gives itself to the lower. I also talk about love in like the attention that the lower has for the higher and also for the sacrifice that the higher does for the lower. So I see love like as those three things. Like the the lower going towards the higher is love, the higher going towards the lower is love, and the union of those in the same thing is also love. And then like if I try to make the mapping to things like the combination problem, what happens is everything is everything as love to some level. Everything is love, participates in love at some level. Forms do it in a way that's like different than matter. Forms like they just give themselves lower. If matter gives itself like matter emerges into form. So what happens is you can have greater complexification when those two well, yeah, you can have more and more complexification when more and more matter and forms meet together. And the summit, like the most complex thing, would be like the ultimate union of those things, which would happen in the incarnation. And even within like the union that all of this thing, like this creation between heaven and earth, between forms and matter, as with the creator behind all of them all. So I would see like love going bottom up from matter to forms, from also top-down matters forms to matter. All of these interpenetrating layers between creation and also uniting with the creator. So like complexity happens when you have more and more of this interpenetration of levels.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I understand that. That makes sense. And also since we're talking about love, also this is something that I wanted to cover as well. So obviously, love has this, kind of all kinds of connotations when people hear it. So I think I kind of know the answer, but I would like a better answer, or like to have it more further clarified in my thought, which is like number one, like it's clear that what you mean by love is very different than the colloquial usage. So number one, what do we lose by calling it something else? That's point number one. And then point number two is uh like maybe clarify if you how does the let's I don't know exactly how to call this, but let's call it how does the what's the difference between the ontological love compared to the human experience of love, and how do they interconnect, and also what do you think has primacy of, like, is what I'm guessing you have to claim that one is the image of the other, and which one it is it?
Yeah, I think the fundamental one is this process I talked about earlier. So how the higher gives itself to the lower, how the lower becomes body for the higher, and how they unite. Like that is love. I think that's the fundamental definition. You can also say how multiplicity and unity coexist. I think that's the fundamental definition of love. It is not the same definition that most people think of when they think of love. Like typically, I think most people, I suspect, would have connotations of romantic relationships with feelings, especially. I think in our culture, especially, and this has varied through the ages. Like in many, many cultures, for most of human history, like marriage was something of a like pragmatic affair, I would say. Like you need to be with someone to survive and reproduce. And like through this project, you will have romantic feelings of affection that are gonna develop. But like the romantic feelings being the first thing is a pretty recent thing. There are interesting reasons for that, but I don't want to digress. The reason why I want to keep using the word love for this, for the pattern that I'm referring about, is and it's a fair point too because I resist like using consciousness for everything as panpsychists do, but I do want to use the word love in the case of what I'm doing, even if it's not what most people mean by it. And the reason is it's like a battle I'm choosing to have. Like I think we want to get that word back. I think we want to get back the meaning of love being what I'm referring to. I think that's what people meant by it. I think it's a richer definition. I think it's going to help lots of people. So that's why I'm like happy to go against the grain there. And then, like to wrap up, I think there's a last aspect of your question I haven't answered, which is how do I see the relationship between romantic love and the kind of love that I'm talking about? And I think the core is love as I define it. I think it's gonna have all kinds of things that grow around it, like the positive feelings that people typically have in mind and refer to when they talk about love. I see them as I think they're important. I think they participate in the pattern that I said earlier. When you and your wife, let's say, are one and two at the same time, and when it's true, when you're not like completely independent, like doing your own thing, and like having just some kind of formal agreement, and when you're not also just like one thing and nullifying your own individuality, but when you're both like one and many at the same time, then from this fundamental love, like all kinds of side effects of love will manifest themselves, or the lower levels of love, I could say, will manifest themselves. Like you will have these positive feelings of affection that people refer to. Another way to talk about this is also like that the Greeks had different words for love. There's like agape love, which is more what I said, unity and multiplicity together. But they also add words for like how friendships happen. They add also word for romantic love. Like they had many words for love, but I think the fundamental one would be agape. Um, and what seems to have happened is that in Christianity we ended up like, in many languages having just one word for love that like assembled all of those things. And I think there's power there. There's risk that you lose like nuances and maybe you end up with the same word, but you don't mean the root one. You don't mean agape. You mean like today romantic interests. So that's a risk, but I want to win the word back pretty much.
Right. Okay. Yeah, awesome. That makes a lot of sense. And also like the way that you speak about it, uh like in the examples that you give or like how you try to define it, I see a lot of overlap with the logos as well. So it's like how would you differentiate the two and how do they interconnect together, both the logos in the Christian perspective and also the type of love that you're talking about?
It's a good question. I think the it's tricky because the logos, I think, classically, it tends to refer more directly just to forms. Um, to the if you could, I'm pretty sure if you talked to the Greeks about logos, what they would have in mind, mostly, like obviously people disagree about this stuff, but for the most part, all of the interlocking forms, all of the abstract patterns, they are the logos. So the structures of intelligibility behind all of creation, that's the logos. And if you stick with the Greeks, there was a structuring of creation that happened by the logos, but they wouldn't have talked about love. And also the bottom-up aspect was not really there for the Greeks. Like maybe you can see it a little bit in Aristotle, but you kind of have to work hard to see it. I think in Christianity the logos becomes transformed. Like it becomes obvious that the logos gives itself to the lowest, and that the lowest will emerge into the logos. So the logos becomes one with the world, and it becomes a lot closer to what I said about love. So I think you're right to pinpoint that like the definition of logos and love becomes like the same thing in Christianity. But that wouldn't have been the case for the ancients. And like still today, I think because of my background, when I think of logos, I still have first that connotation of like mathematical forms that are going to structure creation. But I think it's fair if you want to associate the logos more closely with love. I think within Christianity, that definitely works.
Right. But even within Christianity, there's still a difference, right? Because, for example, when Christians often uh, talk about Christ, they often say, he's the logos, right? And obviously, there's this idea of that God is ultimately love, and that love is kind of the bedrock reality, but it's still they're still used in different contexts, right? Like if from what I read.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's true, but like you often have this in Christianity where you can. It has to do with also this analogy thing I keep mentioning since the beginning. Um, like in Christianity, you always try to keep the tension alive between the one and the many, between creation and God, behind like between the persons of the Trinity. You try to always keep both poles of all tensions. So let's say when let's say every Christian will understand that the persons of the Trinity are equal. But everyone will also understand that, okay, when you pray for certain things, you pray for the Father. And when you pray for certain things, then you pray for the Spirit. So there are different like missions or roles that the people of the Trinity, the persons of the Trinity do. But we also understand that they're equal. And when we say that God is love, I think typically like it would be more common to associate love with the Holy Spirit. I think that would happen more often in the tradition, but it's also fine to use the same word to talk about the Father or the Son or even the Trinity as a whole. So like I think this happens all the time because of the use of analogy where we don't try to collapse like to either pole of any tension.
Right. Yeah, that helps a lot actually. That's very good. So I wanted to talk a bit about miracles as well before we wrap it up. So we actually This is kind of going to feel like a deja vu for some people because we also talked about miracles on our last conversation right at the end, which actually ended up cutting from the podcast because I didn't want that to be the focus. But when I posted it on the Symbolic group, I posted like a separate video for people that kind of wanted that type of discussion. So, but I was struggling with it now, and I'm still struggling it. I was struggling before, and I'm still struggling a little bit now. I think I've kind of ignored it a little bit. But now I'm trying to give it another try because like as I feel like as I understood Christianity better, I feel like I can embody it a bit better as well. And then the more like there's this kind of like progression of like leaps of faith that I talked about. And so before miracles to me was something that was completely blocked, and now it's something that I've opened up, but I still can't quite understand it. And so I'm in this place of like I'm trying to have this environment of like Cartesian doubt of like starting from first principles and like anything goes, but I still don't quite understand it. And when I heard Pageau talk about it, like he gives a few examples, and I'll give you like my take on why those examples don't land, and maybe you'll be able to kind of help me out on maybe a different way to think about it. So first of all, one of the examples he gives to like set the basic framework is, for example, a rock falling is just like a basic fact in the world with no meaning whatsoever. But then, if that rock saves your life, and if maybe you prayed, that rock needed to fall because of something, because it would save your life, then it's kind of like a little miracle, he claims. And then he kind of can scale that up. That's his argument. But to me, this doesn't make a lot of sense because like that meaning is inside your head. And these types of arguments or these types of claims to me feel very similar to cognitive biases. And like a lot of the times, for example, in the Symbolic group, which I love and I love the community, but like a lot of people post this stuff of like symbolism happens. And like I would say 95% of them are just like classical cognitive biases that you'd find in a psychology textbook introduction. So that's kind of like my reaction to the lowest level. And then on a higher level, some examples that Jonathan gives is the example of a request. So it's like if I ask something for you, that there's kind of like meaning, like emanating from the top down until it manifests physically in the world. Also, the example of the football team, which I always like, and it's quite intuitive. Uh, and so his claim is like, okay, you can see all these levels, and then the highest level would be a miracle. And for example, the miracles that are depicted in the Bible from Christ. But to me, what I struggle is, for example, because he says, for example, Christ walking on water, he's like emanating that meaning into the physical reality of the world and joining it in a specific way. But that is completely different than all the examples you gave previously, because it comes back to this issue of consciousness that I was talking about, even in the infant and other thing. It's like that makes sense within two already conscious agents. And this kind of, for meaning to travel from one place to the other and to manifest physically in the world, it does require this kind of consciousness. And so in the miracles, a lot of times I just don't think that kind of crosses from the examples. And the narrative that I find more compelling for Christ's miracles is simply that, he's God, basically, and God can do whatever he wants. And that doesn't invalidate like the symbolic interpretation of like mastering chaos and whatnot. But the way that I see it, that to me is more intelligible, is that he's doing that to show the pattern of reality. But in the way that he does it is simply because he has mastery over creation. Like to me, that's a way simpler, more logical narrative. But I still can't quite accept it because, that requires the axiom that there's such a thing as God in this specific way, that has this intention and whatnot, and also that he's a creator of the world and whatnot. And so a lot of times miracles are framed this in the sense of like, here's proof that such a thing exists, but then it's so hard to believe. And then to justify it, you can say, oh, but it's possible because this kind of being exists that makes such and such happen. So it feels a bit circular. So does any of this kind of make sense to you?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I have an approach slightly different from Jonathan. I think the way you can do this and why it works for some people is I think if you're really phenomenology first, I could see a way where this would work. But personally, in the examples, as you said, of let's say the rock going down and then like depending on like whether you prayed for it or not, like you see it as a miracle or not. For I don't totally like this because I'm not that keen on like phenomenology first, and I would rather like to see the causality. Like what like I think like the prayer has to play some kind of causal role in what's happening, but beyond the psychological. And that's why I like to give examples where you do see some kind of causal power. So one I often use is the placebo effect, where there's going to be a narrative that happens between you and your doctor, and it's this narrative that's going to have an impact on your biology, let's say. And you can't self-administrate a placebo. You have to have faith in something that happens between you and other people, and you have to actually like trust that this other people, this narrative has a power on you.
I don't think that's true, by the way. I'm not 100% confident, but I'm like 90% confident that the placebo works, even if you know that it's placebo.
No, I'm pretty sure not. I mean, we should check, yeah?
I'll,
But
I'll check the literature later, but I think it's the case. But let's assume I'm wrong, and you can proceed with the argument.
yeah, yeah. Because I think then it gives you like a kind of wedge to think about how this might happen at higher layers. Because also, when you think of like, I like the placebo effect because it's like at a human level, but that really this happens anytime there's the meeting of emergence and emanation. Like when you make a decision, for instance, you're gonna have an impact on your cells that you couldn't have predicted just by looking at your cells. Like if you try to explain what happens, like why you behave in a certain way, looking just at your cells, or even worse, looking just at your atoms, I don't think you'll be able to predict what happens. But if you do have your mind, your attention, that's going to constrain what happens, then you can explain it. And I think similarly, like you can just go down the hierarchy. Like when biologists try to explain how cells behave, they don't try to reduce the behavior to like individual constituents of the cell. They take the cell as a unit that has different patterns, like at the level of the cell, and those are going to constrain what happens at the level of the enzymes and so on. So you explain like things that would be like statistically way too improbable to explain at the lower layer. You're able to explain them if you have the higher level constraints. And I think that's true also in chemistry and even in physics. So I think one non-controversial example of this happening in humans is the placebo effect, where there's a constraint that happens, a narrative that happens, and it's gonna select something in you that's gonna heal you from something. But I think this just keeps going higher. If you're like, let's say, a old church of people who have faith in a narrative at the scale of the church, then I think that can have miraculous impacts on people recovering from this or that. And I know some people for whom this kind of thing happened. So if like you consider at the highest level where God himself was behind all of emergence and emanation, comes and unites himself with creation in emanation and emergence again, then I'm not surprised that you see stuff like Jesus walking on water or healing people. It's like the higher version of things that you already see in creation.
Okay, but the issue with healing the sick is a bit tricky, just because biology is so tricky, and I think that kind of makes the discussion very messy. But like the problem that I was trying to get at, which I think wasn't touched on super directly, unless I misunderstood something, is that if you take the example out of the healing and the placebo, which I think is a decent argument. I still have some issues that I don't quite understand how it works out. But if you take that out and you think about the and you think about meaning towards matter, like inert matter, like how how is that carried over without having to necessarily rely on, well, it happens because, God has power over creation.
But we do that to some extent. Like I'm not like for sure we do that over our own bodies. Like for at least like we do have emanation on our body that is gonna cause some things to there's like maybe even to get back to the placebo effect, like if you there have been studies of people like it's funny, like people who like read online that if they take this or that substance it's gonna heal them from something, So then they take that thing and they do get a positive effect. And then later they learn that the what they read was a fraud, and then the positive effect goes away. So like in the sense the person self-administrated the placebo, but it's because they believed in something bigger than themselves. And it went away when they stopped believing in something bigger than themselves. But for certain, when the person did that and it had a positive impact, like they changed something in their body through their mind. So now the question is, can you imagine that something can change, let's say, outside of your body because of a narrative that went through your mind? I think that's hard. That would be harder than the placebo effect for me to explain. Like, because like I could totally see why. Let's say you're a group of, I don't know, 20 people in a church praying for something, and then one of the people in that group is ill from something. I could totally like see why that would happen. It becomes harder to explain if, let's say, that group of 20 people, they pray for someone who's like not there at all, like someone who's in an hospital and doesn't even know that people are praying for them, and that person is actually ill of something. Like this kind of stuff happens. Like when that happens, I think that's like definitely a higher level than just what you can explain with the placebo effect, because there's no material connection between like the person in an hospital bed like recovering from something because some people prayed for them.
Yeah, but again, I hate to take this stance because it makes me feel like I'm the stupid atheist arguing this stuff, but it's just to try to get a bit more precise. So it's like, but first of all, I think some of these examples are tricky because again, there's so much cognitive biases that play into it, and outside cognitive bias, even just like pure statistics, regression to the mean, all yeah, all things. So like, let's take biology out. So it's like you have your church, people are praying for some reason they need to play, they need to pray that, the rock does fall, from on something, right? And there's no way for it to fall. It's physically impossible through gravity, through the mechanics, through Newtonian laws. That rock cannot move, but it moved. How?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, in those cases, I think so. I can only give analogies to what happens within creation, but they're not going to be that good. Like the best I could do is what I already said. So for those things, the way that I would explain them is like it's not going to be naturalistic. I think the way that I would explain it is God wants us to play a role within creation. Some of like most of it is that like we physically do things with our bodies. Like for almost everything that we do, we will either like ourselves move things, or we will like maybe say words or use tools so that other things are going to move. Like maybe people are going to like obey what we say, or tools that we created will do something. But it's not like that surprising that sometimes God wants us to participate just through prayer in doing something. Like it's not that surprising that I mean I would probably not want to say that it was physically impossible for the rock to fall. I think most of the time what happens through prayer is possible. It's just like extremely unlikely. Like it's just but it's potentially it could potentially happen, but it needs a higher pattern to constrain that possibility so that's like said thing actually happen. Um, so not always, I could say more, but for the benefit of time, the point is just that God set up the world so that lower entities could participate, so that let's say we could move things, do things in the world through normal, like regular actions. We think, we move, and so on. But I'm not that surprised that God also set up the world so that sometimes it's through our prayer that things will happen.
So before we were talking about miracles and so forth, and we were kind of like trying to parse this out of like how these things are possible, how they relate to the framework of Christianity. And at some point I was mentioning kind of how there's some level that the framework that you're exposing, at least in my opinion, the way that I interpret it, relies to some degree on this notion of a creator kind of like being intelligible. That's kind of like something that you accept to some degree. And obviously, it's a big tenet of overall Christianity. So obviously, if you're a Christian, that makes complete sense. But I wanted to try to explore that a little bit more because at least I feel that for me, that's kind of like a big kind of obstacle from like fully going into the tradition. And I think it's the same for a lot of people, especially if they come from like a non-theist background. And so when I initially started getting into religion, what helped me the most was to kind of like start thinking about the good as such in like a very Platonic, Greek sense. And then once I thought about that, then a lot of other things started to make sense, and then I kind of went from there. And obviously, there's a huge part of Christianity that aligns itself with that view and kind of with that tradition. But at the same time, there's something that, at least for me, that feels somewhat separate, which is this notion of this like supreme being that created the universe, and that there's some sort of agency and some sort of minds.
Do you mean that the good is the super being, or do you mean that you oppose the good to a super kind of being?
I would say that, as far as I understand it, they're usually kind of the same thing, right? So like God is the good, right? I think that's a reasonable kind of framework from Christianity, but yeah, there's kind of like small details that we could kind of go on. But I would say just like trying to keep it broad, I think is helpful. And to me, I've always struggled to understand like why that's the case exactly. And I know that there's some arguments of like the the unmoved mover and kind of Aquinas's kind of arguments for God, they're not proper arguments, but kind of like um, thinking along those lines. And I always struggled with that. Number one, I'm not sure if that's the yeah, I just don't think that the arguments are convincing enough most of the time. And also, it makes me a bit skeptical that even though um, even though the notion of a creator and kind of a beginning is pretty widespread, like across cultures, it's not completely universal. So like Buddhism doesn't have this fixation with like this very beginning. They have more of a, well, it depends a bit on the tradition, but generally speaking, they view the universe and reality more as this eternal thing. And also kind of related to this whole creator issue, like for example, when we were speaking about emanation and emergence, whatnot, a lot of times we speak about the one. So obviously very, very Platonic. And I can see how it's conceptually useful. But then once we get into more like theistic terms, again, I find it hard to like justify of like, the is that truly a thing? Like has like in the way that we're trying to describe it, or is it just like a useful metaphor or a useful concept to talk about different things? Um, and I feel that's I might be wrong, but the way that I intuit, I feel like this is a similar perspective that Vervaeke has. So, for example, when you speak about I've heard you say, not sure if it was in this conversation or some other conversation, that Vervaeke's metaphysics, they kind of do have a place for God, even though he doesn't call it God. And I see that making a lot of sense when it's from this perspective of like the goods, but less in the sense of like the creator. And so, for example, I think Vervaeke would kind of be in the same position where, there's some apprehension about this Christian notion of God as this like conscious creator being of the universe. So that was a long exposition, but I just wanted to provide some context. And the actual question is more like, what do you think that I'm missing, or that Vervaeke is missing, assuming that we're kind of in the same camp? Maybe there's some differences, but what do you think is needed to like make this bridge, make this jump to a fully theistic worldview when the concept of the creator and the concept of the good are both coherent and make sense and they're joined together?
I don't think that John is missing anything, by the way. So when he speaks to like very informed theologians like Bishop Barron or Bishop Maximus, like they don't disagree with him on how he conceives of the one or the creator. I think John doesn't want to employ the, let's say, explicitly Christian terms too often because it's true that in culture they have often been split apart. So sometimes John will speak of common theism as opposed to classical theism. Classical theism would align much more closely to what like John believes, but the terms of common theism. So when you start referring to God as a being without being careful to say that God is also beyond being, or when you say that And God created the universe, and you make it sound like it happened in time rather than outside of time, more primordially. I understand why he's reticent to use the terms of common theism because he wants to avoid the problems that he saw, especially when you grew up as a fundamentalist. Like people use those terms without all the Neoplatonic backing that you would have in Bishop Barron, for instance. So I don't think that anything is really missing. It's just that in Christianity or any religion that is very widely applicable, you'll have a language that needs to scale. And like the theologians will speak about God more abstractly using philosophical categories where they can talk and use the terms that the Neoplatonists or the Platonists were using, and then you're in agreement with John. But sometimes it's very practical to also use the terms that everyone can understand, even kids. So you just have, as someone who can understand both of those levels, you just have to bridge yourself, I think. Like I'm comfortable using both terms and I'm comfortable with people using both kinds of terms because I'll just do the mapping in my mind. Like if I see someone who I think has the ability to understand the more lofty terms, then I might take more time to stress that, but it's just like to maybe avoid some mistakes. But I don't think there is an issue with the language being analogical. Um, also, another thing I can add is that in in Christianity, and we talked about analogy before and the importance of emanation all the way down, to make also emergence all the way up possible and valuable. It's also why I'm comfortable with analogy. Like I think that the highest comes down to the lowest layers. And in doing that, like it means that we can talk about the one using lower language and it's fine. We just have to keep that up in a hierarchy to the extent that we're able. And not everyone needs to know the lofty terms, but it's important that the people who can do know them.
Right. Yeah. So I haven't seen that conversation from Vervaeke. I'll have to watch that. So perhaps I'm slightly wrong in kind of like equating my position with his. But kind of like putting Vervaeke aside then, which seems more aligned with yours. I'm not sure exactly how I see like the one like mapping into like a traditional theistic view. Like I understand that a lot of times, in the stories, maybe they're a bit more personalized than they should because it's a story. But at the end of the day, correct me if I'm wrong, like Christianity does have this insistence that, at the end of the day, it is a mind to some degree, right? And so that's kind of what I have the biggest trouble with. And I'm not sure. Yeah, so like help me maybe bridge a little bit, and perhaps if I understood correctly, you also came from like a completely materialistic atheist background. So like, how did that concept made more sense to you?
I mean, to understand God as a mind or three minds, maybe even with the Trinity, it's hard to say. Um, it's like the classical Neoplatonic argument. So there's something that came from Neoplatonism, which is from the existence of abstract truths and the way that they all interlock together. So a good treatment of this, by the way, is in Edward Fraser's book, um, Five Proofs. I don't remember the exact title, but like his book on the five classical proofs. And in one of the chapters, I think it's the third chapter, he talks about the existence of abstract truths as something that really exists, but as to exist non-materially. So let's say an example that we've used before is let's say the Pythagorean theorem. I think that theorem is true regardless of the existence of humans to learn about it or to prove it. I think the material universe could have been different or not existent at all, and the theorem would still have been true. So this is a mathematical truth that exists. I also think that if you deny its existence, you will run into issues if you try to use any kind of abstract truth. Because what I said about the Pythagorean theorem, I could say about any abstract truth. And if you want to employ any kind of abstract truth in your system and you don't give them a strong ontological status, you're going to run into issues. You're going to start undercutting yourself. So I think you have to like say that those things exist, but they don't exist materially. Like they could exist without the material universe existing at all. So the move that the Neoplatonists made, and it was taken up into Christianity by people like Saint Augustine, is that you put all of those, you consider all of those forms, all of those patterns that all interlock together. And they interlock because like truths will really like imply each other and they're all intermeshed. So like the Pythagorean theorem also like is connected with a bunch of other theorems. And that's just in math, but like all the truths, all the abstract eternal truths are all connected together in one system that is analogous to our minds. When we apprehend the truth, we're a reflection of this. Like we need to work out the proofs in time, and we only see a tiny fraction of all of these interlocking truths when we understand the theorem, let's say, or when we understand any abstract truth. But in the mind of God, like the mind of God is all of those abstract truths. Probably more stuff too, but at the very least, like it makes me comfortable to say that okay, there's a creator that is this mind, this fundamental structure that everything obeys. Like the maybe the laws of physics could have been different, but mathematics couldn't have been different. Like there are fundamental constraints on possibility that shape reality, and that is the mind of God. At least like the mind of God is probably more, but at least I can grant that.
Right. But when you say that you could that they kind of imply a mind, the way that those truths, abstract truths are joined together, like why is that the case? Because even though I understand quite well, I think kind of like this emanistist, this emanation perspective of like the laws of physics, like constraining reality from the top up, like I can see that operating completely like neutrally without a divine mind. So like how do you make that jump from abstract truths to abstract truths that are the mind of God, and th that space which is the mind of God is analogous to something like the human mind.
I mean, I think at this stage it's probably a language issue, but like traditionally, what like Christian thinkers mean by mind is just something that exists but is not material. So I don't think like it's not like we're trying to say that God has a consciousness like our own. Like it is analogous in some ways, but like the burden of proof classically was not that high. Like what people meant by mind wasn't like it might not be exactly what you're trying to mean by mind.
Right. Okay. Okay, that's interesting. Um, Okay, and this is going to interact a little bit more with my question, I think. So I'll try to phrase it a bit concisely. But one of the things that also a lot of people struggle with Christianity, that I also struggle a little bit, kind of connected with this topic, is that you know this issue of the divine mind, even though with all these caveats that you just addressed, um, it seems a bit hard to accept. But coming from a physicalist background, let's say, but the naturalist Christianity, I think, is a kind of an easy bridge. And what I mean by naturalist Christianity is kind of like within the path that I was describing of like, the ultimate good, and then kind of relating religion has that, right? But then that's a very abstract like conception, because when you say that and then you try to apply it to the Christian story, it's like, okay, but then what is Christ? And my answer, for example, when I started kind of like exploring religion and trying to take Christianity more seriously, was that it was just this human being that just happened to be really aligned with the ultimate good. And for me, that was good enough. Like to me, that was a very rich story that had like ultimate sacred significance, but it's not the exact story of Christianity. Like Christianity does quite push hard against that view, is that no, there is such a thing as God, the Father, in the typical sense that I've been trying to describe, even though it's a bit tricky because of the terms, like you're trying to allude to. And then Christ was literally, this embodiment of this mind in some capacity. Um, and I think that is quite tricky for a lot of people to accept. And also, if you have this view, this classical Christian view, one of the problems that I have trouble with is also that tradition becomes tradition and the Bible kind of being a subset of tradition, it becomes a lot harder to negotiate with, because there's some issues, some stories of the Bible that are kind of just weird or just don't make a lot of sense. And obviously, sometimes it's just because you haven't understood the meaning. Obviously, that's completely true. And I find deeper and deeper meaning in the scriptures, in the tradition, the more I look into it. But also, there's some stuff that I just don't think makes a lot of sense. And I'm not sure if it will ever make sense, even if I study this like very, very closely. And within the naturalist Christianity, let's say that I was trying to allude to, this is quite easy to solve because you see kind of this whole tradition of kind of like being divinely inspired, let's say, to the degree that they align with the ultimate goods, but not necessarily kind of like this trick thing. So from a naturalist perspective, you can easily kind of like negotiate these weird aspects of Christianity to some degree. But within what I'm going to call like a more literalist interpretation of Christianity, or like being more true to the tradition, it's much harder to do that because there is an instance that it's literally the word of God in many ways. So like it becomes very hard to negotiate, in my opinion, if you take that seriously. And to me, there's a lot of problems that make it a lot harder to embrace tradition, like the problem of natural evil, the kind of the randomness of evolution, a lot of inconsistencies in the scripture. Um, and so all of that I can try to negotiate a little bit if the commitment to the tradition is softer and there's not this mind kind of like operating within history, but more so history unfolding by divine inspiration. And those are kind of two different views of history and tradition and of the scripture.
I'm not sure they're that different though. Like I think it's similar to the issue we had before. I seems like you're, I don't know, like have you been to a church and talked to people about this? Because I think things are more flexible in practice than you tend to think. And if you like talk with theologians, they would often tend to like agree with the like more theological ways in which you put things, but just without like neglecting the simpler languages for wide applicability.
Yeah, but I'm not so sure. Like well, first of all, I don't have a lot of experiences with theologians directly. That's for sure. And also not so much with like the very day to day, because I live in a country that I don't speak the language, so it's kind of hard. It's kind of hard to do that. But I do think that that comes to some degree, and I notice that a lot. And the reason why this is such a big issue for me is because in the last couple of years, I have been trying to adopt like a more traditional Christianity, and I see those issues like coming up, and that's why I'm trying to resolve them.
How have you been trying to adopt it though? Like, what does it look like? Is it that you're watching things or getting?
No, I'm trying to embody, so like the ritualistic aspect of it, let's say. And also I'm trying to understand it while curbing my rational skepticism, let's say. So it's like if because for example, in the past what I used to have is like, okay, I can understand this like naturalized Christianity, let's say, but then like I have no idea how the resurrection can happen, for example, right? And then I was like, okay, I'm just gonna block that off because that just makes no sense. I can make sense of it. And now I'm like, okay, but tradition says this is really important. So like I'm gonna try to figure it out, right? And and because I see some kind of divine truth, even though I don't understand to what degree, to what type of truth it is, I'm gonna kind of assume that it's true, or at least kind of like live as if it's true to some degree. And so that's kind of how I've been approaching it. And to some degree they clash because, for example, I was just reading today. I started like this book, like The Ancient Path by Father Bailey, and it's great. But for example, at some point he was like trying to he thought it was weird that evolution was like just assumed to be true, and I'm like, you must be damn crazy to like question that, right? So that conflict does exist to some degree, and I don't want to overplay it. Obviously, evolution doesn't imply that theism isn't true and whatnot, but there is this kind of clash for sure. So yeah, how do you view? I mean, you already answered to some degree, but to the degree that you can expand, like how do you see these two perspectives, and how do you see that someone coming from my worldview, how these can be dissolved and like embraced to some degree?
Yeah, I mean, first, I think it seems that you're largely alone. Like you're not embedded in a church community with people you can talk to and like people who can help you out with resources and so on. Yeah, so I think that's a part of the difficulty. Because if you try to do things yourself, you can wind up in places where like it was just not meant for you. So, for instance, I don't know if that's the case of the person you're reading, but I know you can easily land in groups of orthodox thinkers that like often speak to people from like ex-fundamentalist backgrounds in the US, and they're gonna have a different set of concerns from the ones you might have as a materialist. Like there's a lot of people, for instance, converting to orthodoxy in North America who come from a biblical fundamentalist background, and for them, like the issues of materialism and science just don't apply. Like the issues for them are all like intra-biblical. How can you show the truths of, let's say, traditional Orthodox or Catholic Christianity starting from just the Bible? And that's what they do. If you want to grapple more, if you want thinkers who grapple more with science and faith, then probably like some Catholic thinkers from Europe would make more sense. A little bit from America, but I'd say it's more from like the European tradition that you can find people who dealt with this for a long time because that's where materialism came from. So those are gonna tend to be, they will tend to be more Catholic thinkers because like Europe was more Catholic. So that's like one example of how like if you so you're in Europe right now. So like if you talked with like Catholics in Europe and you found like of course if you went to a church, you would probably like it might take a while before you can find like someone who can speak the more intellectual stuff. Actually, man, if you are able to get access to the priest and talk to him, that might work, but it depends on the parishes. Like all that is to say, if you speak to many people, they might not help you, but it shouldn't be that long, that difficult to find someone who has the intellectual baggage to help you out. And then, like, because he's in Europe, he's more likely to have your context and to recommend stuff that makes sense. If you read stuff addressed to people from the south of the US, like it very well might clash in the way that you're saying. So for me, like many of those issues were addressed because I had the chance to have a great community here with very smart people who could recommend books. And I could talk to about specific problems that were much more my problems than similarly to what you seem to be facing. Like I didn't have to like search very long for answers to my more scientific and materially minded kind of questions because like in the Catholic scene, lots of thinkers have done this. If I had tried to answer this with Orthodox thinkers from the US, probably wouldn't have worked, or from Russia for that matter, because they also didn't deal with things the same way. So that's my answers. Like Christianity is very wide, and context matter. Context matters for specific answers that you need as an individual.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And that's something that I hear repeatedly, like this problem of kind of community. And then yeah, I've been trying to bridge that to some degree, but it's quite difficult. But it's good to hear it from you, so that's kind of hammered even deeper into my head. So yeah, so very last quick question. So like th this is a bit of a broad question. Obviously, we don't have a lot of time, so pick it as any way you will. But like, what do you think made you evolve as a human or a deeper human through the tradition of Christianity?
Yeah, I mean it's very large. Maybe just talking about the beginning of the path is what will be most useful because really I think I've been on the path since then, but like having like being taken out of materialism and nihilism and being given an objective that I see like through a glass darkly, but still being given an objective that I can work towards. And that just has always kept giving. Like it never happened that I just like stagnated and like went back. Like I can tell that if I look at, I mean, obviously on a short scale you can stagnate or go back, but on like if I look at my life at any period of let's say 3 months, I can always see progress since I converted because I just keep getting pulled higher by like an objective, and I see it ever more clearly. But I think it's just gonna keep getting clearer all my life, and yeah, that's it.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, that's quite inspirational. I certainly can't say that I would say about this the same thing about my life, at least in such a short period of time, like 3 months. So maybe, yeah, I guess I'm just doing this very wrong. I need to reevaluate.
But I mean, I have the luck of a great community. Like if you're trying to do this alone and you don't know the language of the people around you, that I could see why that would be a bigger challenge.
Right. Yeah. Okay, so I know you have to go, so I really appreciate kind of like you taking the time, even extra time, to come here on the podcast. It's absolutely a pleasure to talk with you. I really like you, and I really like your thinking, and I think these types of conversations are just super important. So just thank you a lot for the effort and for the time. And also for everyone listening, highly recommend his book. I'll link it in the description. He also has a course on the symbolic world as well, which I forgot to mention. So if you like these types of themes and maybe you already read the book, consider joining the course as well. I haven't personally taken the course yet, but I'll probably do so at some point just to get the arguments a little bit deeper. So yeah, thank you again, JP. It was truly a pleasure. And yeah, is there anything else extra that you'd like to plug or say?
No, all good. Thanks, Thiago. Great questions.